Asato ma sadgamaya tamaso ma jyotirgamaya mrityurma amritam gamaya. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Om, lead us from the unreal to the real, lead us from darkness unto light, lead us from death to immortality. Om, peace, peace, peace. Namaskar and good evening, everybody. Respected President of Calcutta Club, Prashanto Babu, who was indefatigable, whose endless persistence, that's the result which you see here this evening. And this amazing audience, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure to be here, and I mean it. I couldn't have expected this amazing gathering here in Calcutta Club this evening. I must start with a confession. The Calcutta Club, I've been here once earlier, I was giving a talk, and this was the place of one of my greatest faux pas. So I'll start with that. This was more than 10 or 12 years ago, and the Rotary Club had invited me for a talk here at one of the rooms here in Calcutta Club. And I remember going in there. I had come early, so I was waiting for the audience to gather. And this lady, she came up to me, very gracious, very hospitable. She made me feel at home. We talked. She was asking me about where all I had given talks. And I said, last week I had gone to Burdwan University. And she said, oh, Bardhaman Vishwavidyalaya Kothai, where did you give your talk? And I described that Golab Bagh campus there. And then she said, oh, ota to amar ghar chilo. I was a little taken aback. That is a big auditorium. How can it be, like a girl's room? Then she said, oh, I should have introduced myself. She was the princess of Burdwan. So Burdwan Rajbari. So she had, her father is basically the one who had donated the Golab Bagh campus. And as a kid, she lived in the which is now a university auditorium, ওই বাচ্চা মেয়েটির রাজকুমারীর ওটা ঘর ছিল. Now, the faux pas was, when the talk started, I started with, Swami Vivekananda, practical Vedanta, and Swami Vivekananda, how he had said that this Vedanta was most practical. It was of interest to kings and emperors. If you go back to the Upanishads, Bhagavad Gita, Krishna, Arjuna, in the Upanishads you go back to King Janaka and others, Ajatashatru and others. So it was a philosophy which was considered to be of utmost practical use by kings and emperors, people with tremendous responsibilities, those who were extremely busy. The emperors and kings of ancient times were, they had real responsibilities. They were not like the royalty of present times, who are basically just, symbols and they don't have actual power or responsibility. এটা আমি মুখস্থ করে এসেছিলাম, বলে গেলাম. Now she was sitting right there in front. Then I realized suddenly the gentleman sitting next to her was nudging her, ওই তোমার বিষয় বলছে আর কি. But yes, that's a good place to start. Vedanta is a philosophy which is of tremendous practical utility. I think that's the reason why the Bhagavad Gita, Vedanta was put in the Bhagavad Gita, which is set in the battlefield, and not in an ashram, not in Sanskrit or toll, like a rishi's ashram or in a monastery. It's set in the battlefield, in the midst of crisis. And the highest philosophy is taught there. Arjuna's question had nothing to do with philosophy. He just wanted an answer, to solve his ethical dilemma. But instead of giving him a direct answer, should I fight this battle or should I not? Krishna gave him the highest Vedantic philosophy, drawing upon the Upanishads. Therefore, Vedanta is something that is useful in our daily life. If kings and emperors, people who were very busy under tremendous stress and responsibility, if they found a use for it, if they found it of great psychological support and source of strength and inspiration in their day-to-day lives, how much more so we can derive benefit from it. Swami Vivekananda says that it's no excuse to say that we are busy, we have no time. Those emperors and kings were far busier than we are. If they found time for it, we can very well find time for philosophy in the midst of our life. So we'll dive straight into the heart of Vedanta. What I propose to do here in the time remaining to me is explore the heart, the core of Vedanta. I'll present it in a language, as far as I've understood, in a language which is relatable in this day and age. And then we will see what use is it to us, to everybody here. Not just for monks, not just for scholars, but also for the person in the midst of the daily struggle of life, everybody. Vedanta starts with the question, who am I or what am I? This question goes back to very ancient times. Right now there is an upsurge in interest in consciousness studies. We are living at a very interesting time. In the last 20 years or so, psychologists, brain scientists, neuroscientists, philosophers, AI, people interested in AI and computer science, a lot of people are interested in what is consciousness. Evan Thompson, who is a professor of philosophy at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, in his book, Waking, Dreaming, Being, he begins the book by saying, consciousness studies did not start today. It's not a new subject. It started thousands of years ago in the Indo-Gangetic plain in the texts called the Upanishads. Thousands of years ago. And then he goes on to say, these Upanishads are so central in the history of human thought that we should date history not by BC and AD, but before Upanishad and after Upanishad. Now, as a monk, as an Indian, we are a little reticent. We won't go forward. We feel it's rather in poor taste, to say that all of history should be dated with before Upanishad and after Upanishad. But Shahib Jokhon bolchen thiki ache. I mean, since he has said it, Evan Thompson has said it. But it's important. What's the question there? One of those Upanishads, they're all in the form of inquiries, questions, and philosophical explorations. One Upanishad starts like this. Kene shitam patati preshitam mana, kene shitam vachamimam vadanti, chakshu shrotra kaudeva yunakti. That means, inspired by what, illuminated by what, impelled by what are these words being uttered? Are these thoughts being thought in the mind? By what do we get the experience of seeing and hearing? All our conscious experiences. And then the answer is given in a rather paradoxical way. Shrotrasya shrotram manaso manoyat. The answer to this question, what is that which gives us the experience of thinking, talking, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching? And the answer is, it is the ear of the ear, it is the eye of the eye, it is the mind of the mind, it is the speech of the speech. It's an indirect way of referring to consciousness. That one principle in all of us, which gives us this first-person experience. It's a bit like all these electrical devices. Here is the microphone, which is amplifying sound. Here are the bright lights, which are illuminating everything. There is the screen, where it projects an image. All of these, the devices are different. The functions they perform are various. But they're all inert until there's one principle which runs through all of them and makes them do what they're designed to do. And we'll of course say it's electricity. That's a good example, a good metaphor. There is one principle behind all our conscious experiences, and that is consciousness. Call it consciousness, call it awareness. There are many, many words in Sanskrit for this principle. Chaitanya, Chetan, Chit, Sambit, Bodha, many words. This is something that our ancient Indians, Hindus, the Vedic Hindus, Buddhists, Jains, philosophers of a wide range of views, they investigated what is consciousness. Centuries ago, millennia ago. Now, before we go on, let me deal with one possible question. Someone might say, "Ete boro kotha ki?" There is a brain. Nowadays we know the brain functions and it generates consciousness. That's it. Why make such a big deal out of it? There's nothing very philosophical or even less so spiritual about consciousness. So here we have to stop and think a little bit. I'd heard a talk by Marvin Minsky. He was a very famous mathematician with seminal contributions to information science. So in one place, he's a reductionist as far as consciousness is concerned. He says there is no mystery about consciousness. It is just that we don't understand seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting. We don't understand thinking, remembering, desiring. Then we put all of it in one basket and call it the problem of consciousness. But when we investigate these processes in depth, we will find some kind of physical basis for all of these things. So this idea, which might be called, which is called materialist reductionism. Consciousness is nothing very great. It's just the brain and its activities. That's all. This idea is not new. Thousands of years ago, there were materialists in ancient India, the so-called Charvakas, who said, this Chaitanya, consciousness, how is it produced? And they gave an example which we today in India, especially in Bengal, can easily relate to. They said, when you chew a pan, and I can say pan here, I have to do a lot of work to explain what a pan is in the United States. But when you chew a pan, there's nothing red in the constituents of the pan. But when we chew it, then your tongue turns red, your lips turn red. So just as the components of the pan, which are not red, but upon being chewed, they produce a red color. Similarly, the physical components of the body, where there is no consciousness, but when they interact with each other, they produce this wonderful thing called consciousness. It's entirely physical. So this is the position of the Charvaka. And in principle, it's exactly the position of the materialist reductionist today. Is there anything special about consciousness? Well, I am here to tell you that there is. We live in a time, the last 20-25 years have been very amazing in this regard. First of all, this question of consciousness is very important. It's very, very important. It's because of this that you are able to hear what I am saying. That you're able to see me. I'm able to think and speak. All our personal experiences, our first-person experiences, what we call subjective experiences, basically our life itself is because of consciousness. So what is consciousness is a big question. Is it just the brain, or is it something different? Is there something special about consciousness? Right now, we are living in an age, there is something called the hard problem of consciousness. David Chalmers, who is an Australian philosopher, and he, in fact, is right now in New York University. He's the head of the Mind-Brain Consciousness Unit. He coined the phrase, the hard problem of consciousness, a couple of decades ago. By that, what he means is that what we call consciousness, this deep personal experience, it cannot be reduced to the objective processes going on in the brain. His point is this. What we observe in the brain, as you go deeper with our latest imaging technologies, fMRI scans and all, when we observe what's going on in the brain, the last and the most precise, the subtlest thing we can detect are the subtle electrical activities going on in the neurons in the brain. Fine. So the final thing that you can detect with our instruments, the last objective thing that you can detect in the brain are some electrical activity going on in the neurons. How that electrical activity translates into our vivid first-person experience. You are seeing colors. You're hearing sound. We feel pain. We feel pleasure. We think. We imagine. We love. We hate. We remember. We fail to remember. We are awake. We dream. We sleep. All of these experiences. How is it bursts of electricity? There is some correlation, clearly. When the electrical activity in the brain, there's a neural correlate. So when you feel pain, and the scientist will scan the brain and see that some part of the brain is lit up. But is it correlation? Is not causation. And especially when the explanatory gap, it's called an explanatory gap, the gap is so big. Imagine, burst of electricity, taste of Rasgulla. There's a huge gap. How is it translating into the vivid first-person experience? And it's not a small thing. This vivid first-person experience is what we call life itself. And so David Chalmers said, you cannot reduce our first-person experiences. All these experiences of seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching, thinking, remembering. এই যে ভেতরের অনুভব, the Sanskrit word is very interesting, anubhava. So this anubhava, you cannot reduce it to just brain processes. How are these brain processes producing a subjective experience? Notice, everything in the universe, whatever you see here, has a physical dimension, and that's all. None of these things have an internal subjective aspect to it, except your brain. How is that possible? The brain has an objective aspect, which you can scan and dissect and observe. But the internal subjective aspect, which is basically you and I and him and her, how? So this is called the hard problem of consciousness. About 25 years ago, one of the leading neuroscientists, Christoph Koch, and David Chalmers, they had a bet, a challenge, a bet. Christoph Koch said the way neuroscience is progressing, within 25 years, we'll be able to explain consciousness in terms of brain activity. 25 years. And David Chalmers said, no, you cannot do it. Because it's, in principle, you're making a category mistake. You're trying to explain something that is subjective in terms of objective processes. It can't be done. So they had a bet, 25 years. And they'd forgotten about it until about a few months ago somebody reminded them, 25 years are over. So who won the bet? Have we been able to understand consciousness in terms of brain? And the unanimous response was, no. In the last 25 years, neuroscience has progressed, brain science has progressed, but we are not even one step closer to understanding what consciousness is. So I think finally, it came out in, I think, Scientific American or somewhere, and there was an article, one of the leading science magazines. It was all over the news. Finally, Christoph Koch had to admit defeat, and he handed over his, I think, a crate of champagne or something to David Chalmers. And they said, and finally he said, give us 25 years more. So this is called promissory materialism. Promissory materialism means, I will explain consciousness in terms of brain, একটু সময় দরকার 25 বছর 50 বছর দিন, then I will be able to explain it. And one scientist actually told me, Massimo, who is a philosopher and a biologist in the City University of New York. Once we were talking about this and in a philosophy seminar which he holds, and he said, look Swami, it's no big deal. Life was considered to be mysterious 100 years back, and we thought science can never explain life. But today, we are able to explain life down to its molecular level. And that's a good enough example, a good enough explanation. So we promise, 25 years later, 50 years later, we'll be able to explain consciousness in that way and give a physical explanation for consciousness. Now, I said to him, that's an error in principle. I'll tell you why it's an error in principle. I gave him the argument. You see, when you say, I will explain life in terms of at the basic molecular level, what we are basically doing is taking a very complex objective phenomenon and explaining it in terms of more fundamental, more basic objective phenomena. There is no problem in principle in doing that. It's hard in practice, but no problem in principle. But when you say, I am going to use objective phenomena, bursts of electricity in your brain, in the nervous system, in the neurons, to explain your subjective first-person experiences, there's a problem in principle. It's a category mistake. See, this thing becomes very clear from the Vedantic perspective. The perspective is this. What is consciousness from a Vedantic perspective? Whatever you can label as this, anidam chaitanyam, whatever you can label as this, that's an object, jado. This table, Therefore, it's an object. This shirt is an object. Even this body, it's an object. Even further, which is not understood in the philosophy of mind even today, there's a difference between mind and consciousness. Can we say this thought, this memory, this pleasure, this pain? We can say that. We do say it. In that case, even pleasure, pain, memory, thoughts, they are also jado, object. And they are not consciousness. They are objects of consciousness. Therefore, life explained in terms of molecular activity, jado explained in terms of jado. Fine. But if you want to explain consciousness in terms of electrical activity in the brain, you are trying to explain Chaitanya in terms of jado. No, there's a jump. Of course, you might say that did it make any impression on him, this argument? It didn't. It didn't elicit any response from him. It's not that easy. Anyway, so this is the background. We are right now, there are a number of thinkers in the West coming not at all from an Eastern philosophy perspective. They are not coming from a Buddhist perspective or an Upanishadic perspective, entirely from the perspective of neuroscience or philosophy of mind, and they are seriously doubting whether consciousness can ever be explained in terms of brain. So this is the hard problem of consciousness. Now, let's do a little bit of Vedantic inquiry. Actually see for ourselves what Vedanta says. Vedanta says that this consciousness, it is pervasive in our lives. When you see, you are conscious. When we hear, we are conscious. When we smell, taste, touch, we are conscious, we are aware. These are first-person experiences. What we see, hear, smell, taste, touch, that keeps changing. But one fact does not change. It requires consciousness to explain, to experience all of these things. Consciousness runs in and through all these experiences. The point here is the same question in the Kena Upanishad. What is that one thing which illumines our thinking, hearing, seeing, smelling, tasting, touching? In contrast it to Minsky's objection. It's not one thing. It's a basket of problems. You are thinking it's one thing. But here, the question in the Upanishad was it is one thing. And right now we are beginning to see that consciousness might be its own one thing, not a separate set of problems. So, when we see, hear, smell, taste, touch, whatever, we are conscious. When we think, we are clearly conscious. When we remember, we are conscious. When we fail to remember, tip of the tongue, we are conscious. When we desire something, we are conscious. When we hate, when we love, we are conscious. When we laugh and cry, we are conscious. All through our waking hours, consciousness runs in and through, and the claim is it is the same consciousness. What changes are the objects of experience. What changes are the thoughts in the mind. But consciousness illumines all of them, and it's that one unchanging consciousness. And not only in waking, when we fall asleep and we dream, in our dreams also, these are conscious experiences. What we experience changes. The dream, this waking world disappears and a dream world appears. But same consciousness runs through the waking and the dream, because first-person experience continues in waking and in dream. And the big claim in Vedanta is that in deep sleep, sushupti, when we fall asleep, when there is no experience of the external world, there is no experience of a dream world. In fact, there is no experience of a separate experiencer. I am sleeping. Such kind of experience is not there. If you experience that, then you are not sleeping. And yet the utter blankness, the utter darkness of deep sleep, Vedanta claims that's also an experience. And logically it makes sense, because we wake up and we claim, I was awake, I slept and dreamt, and there was a period of absolute blankness, I did not know anything. If we can report that, then it must have been an experience, a very peculiar kind of experience, not a subject-object experience, but an experience nevertheless. This one consciousness running through all of this, this is called the witness consciousness or Sakshi Chaitanya. So what? So what, one might say. Look at the applications of this Sakshi Chaitanya. All our problems, sources of pain and trouble and travail are in the world or in our relationships to the world, or in the body, or in the mind. I have a pain. Where? In the body. Notice, when you fall asleep and you dream, you don't experience the physical pain. But you might experience the suffering of a nightmare in the dream, right? So, all of these problems are physical problems, mental problems. If the consciousness by itself is distinct from the body, distinct from the mind, then the problems may belong to the body-mind, but not to consciousness. There's this lovely story which I have repeated so many times. I think some of you may have already heard it, but it's very telling. A gentleman went to the certain monk in the Himalayas and said, in Hindi, this story I'll translate, but he said, Mahatma ji, मैं बहुत दुखी हूँ. Oh Swami, a monk, I'm in great suffering. I'm suffering. I'm unhappy. And the monk said, do you experience your unhappiness? आपको दुख का अनुभव है? Do you experience your unhappiness? Of course. Because I'm experiencing unhappiness, misery, that's why I have come to you. That's why I'm saying I'm unhappy. Then the monk said, if you experience your unhappiness, दुख का अनुभव अगर आपको है, तो आप दुख के दृष्टा हो, आप दुखी नहीं हो. Just as, what it means is this: if I experience this piece of cloth, then I don't become a piece of cloth. I am the witness of this piece of cloth. If I am the consciousness experiencing this body, then I am the witness of the body. I am not the body. If I am the witness of a thought, then I illumine and experience the thought, but I am not the thought. This feeling of unhappiness, depression, misery, which was not there, consciousness illumined the absence of misery. Now consciousness is illumining the presence of misery in the mind. After some time, consciousness will illumine the absence of misery again in the mind. The misery is not in consciousness as such, it's in the mind. आप दुख के दृष्टा हो, आप दुखी नहीं हो. So this gentleman went and thought that way. It works. It creates a psychological space between us and our troubles. So he came back and he said to the monk, आप ठीक कहते हैं, you are right. मैं बहुत शांत हूँ अब. I'm very peaceful now. Immediately the monk was upon him like a ton of bricks and he said, आप शांत नहीं हो, आप मन में शांति की दृष्टा हो. You are not peaceful. You are the witness of the peace in the mind. You're that same consciousness which is illumining a peaceful mind. Now see, this is brilliant. Because the moment you identify with the peace in the mind, after some time the mind will again become disturbed. And you will say, oh, in the ashram, in the Himalayas, in Calcutta Club of all places, I was very peaceful. Now when I've come out into the Calcutta traffic, I have become very restless again. No. You were the witness of the peace in the mind. You are now the witness of the restlessness in the mind. Being thus free of peace and restlessness, that is true peace. The Upanishads say, Mandukya Upanishad, Shantam. That means the self, consciousness, is not peaceful. The mind can be peaceful or restless. But the consciousness itself is peace itself. Your very nature, our very nature as awareness is peace itself, which knows no disturbance, which cannot be disturbed. New Testament, Bible, Jesus Christ says, peace that passeth understanding. Now, in a Vedantic sense, it immediately makes sense. Understanding is buddhi. And the consciousness is that which illumines the buddhi, illumines the intellect. So the peace, which is the very nature of consciousness, it surpasses, passeth understanding. It's a very Vedantic interpretation of the New Testament statement. Now you see the deep impact, the use of this kind of philosophy. That all our problems, it creates a gap between you and the problems. Somebody came to a monk, and Vedantic monk, and was talking about the sorrows and sufferings in life. And this monk said, I'm not interested in your problems. I'm not interested in your problems. The gentleman thought, how cruel. You're not interested in my problems. The monk said, I'm not interested in your problems. I'm interested in you. The difference between you and your problems, I and my problems, the problems will still remain, but we are better placed to deal with these problems. See, let's take a step back. What can spirituality do and what can it not do? What does spirituality really do? Any kind of spirituality. It's very telling, one of the original sources in Buddhist texts, they talk about this story. Somebody went to the Buddha and asked him a question, a monk. I have a question for you. What is the question? You taught us there is suffering. You remember the Buddhas, how he became the Buddha? He saw an old man and a sick man and a dead man, a dead body. Old age, disease, death. These are forms, major forms of sorrow. The senior most member in our Vedanta society in New York is Bill Conrad. He's 99 years old. And he often says to me, Swami, old age is not for sissies. So you have to be really a tough person to withstand old age. So old age, disease, death, these are sorrow. The Buddha said, yes. And you said there is a freedom from sorrow. And you have found that freedom from sorrow. Nirvana, you have found it. Yes, what is your question? But I see, and we are also trying to follow your teachings. We are trying to be free of sorrow. But we are all getting older. Old age is still there. And we get sick from time to time. Disease is there. Some of us have died. Eventually we will all die. And more so, you, the Buddha, you are getting older. You get disease once in a while. And unfortunately, it's quite possible very soon you will also pass away from this world. So how did you overcome sorrow? Your whole project was, we'll go beyond sorrow. Oh, sorrow is old age, disease, death. Still those things are there. So how have we overcome, how have you overcome sorrow? So the Buddha said that this is what spirituality can do and cannot do. He said, imagine a person hit by an arrow. And imagine the pain. And immediately the person is hit by a second arrow. Imagine the pain and the suffering. And the Buddha says, the first arrow is what the world throws at you. Life, old age, disease, and finally death. That's the first arrow. The second arrow is our reaction to that. Is our reaction to what life is throwing to us. And this is the Buddha's insight. Most of our suffering, not all, most of our suffering is caused by the second arrow. Any doctor, and there are so many doctors among you, any doctor will tell you straight away, yeah, that's right, we have seen patients, some with terminal illness, and they handle it with calmness and dignity and strength. And we have seen patients who don't have such a serious problem, but they bring the house down, and they are unhappy, nothing satisfies them, they're scared, they're terrified. Who is suffering more? It's the second one. The actual cause of suffering is not all that important. It's our reaction to that suffering which is important. And the Buddha said, what I teach you will remove the pain from the second arrow. It will change our response to life. The first arrow, the Buddha said, I cannot do anything about that. Everybody will get older. Everybody will get sick sometime or the other. And everybody, the body will die. But this knowledge is going to save you from suffering. Most of suffering is due to the second arrow. Now you see, in a deep philosophical sense, if I'm able to appreciate myself not as a physical creature, a body, not just as a mental creature, a person, a mind, but also just as this illumining awareness with a mind and a body. From that fortress of awareness, I can look upon the vicissitudes of life, the ups and downs of life, and I can play my role there. I was just reading, if you are enlightened, how does an enlightened person deal with life? A text from the Yoga Vasishta, this morning I was reading. It says that the enlightened one is not concerned about the past, with no regret for the past and no anxiety for the future, deals with the present. Hasan Neva, very nicely put, with a gentle smile. Deals with the present with a gentle smile. Hasan Neva, whatever is presented to you at this moment, no anxiety for the future, no regrets for the past. I saw a cartoon once. How do we live our lives? It's like one of those slapstick, Charlie Chaplin movies. This person is constantly slipping on a banana peel, falling backwards or falling forwards. And that's funny, but that's what we are doing. We continuously keep falling backwards into reminiscence, those were the days. This is a song also, those were the days. Those were the days. Or with regret, why did I do that? Why did I say that? Why did I not do that? And with anxiety for the future, expectation or anxiety for the future. We are continuously either falling forwards or falling backwards. The enlightened one is centered in one's nature as pure awareness, and then deals with the world as it happens, as we go through life. This is not yet Vedanta. There's one more step before I'm done. I'll quickly pass over it. See, what we did now, technically speaking, those who are trained in philosophy, you will recognize it as something called Sankhya. This distinction between consciousness and the rest of the universe. So I am this witness consciousness, and there is this mind and the body and the universe. And these two are distinct. But Advaita Vedanta takes a further step forward and asks this question. Oh, by the way, before